Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tiara Yakini, and I work in the Community Engagement and Education Division at the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. I will be your moderator this afternoon. For full accessibility today, it is critical that speakers first identify themselves by name before proceeding to speak and mute their microphones after they are done speaking. We have ASL interpreters on screen, and live card captioning is available by turning on subtitles using the CC icon on the lower part of the screen. We will have a question and answer portion during today's session, and attendees can use the Q&A function on the lower part of the screen to type in questions for our panelists at any time. With that said, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to this month's installment of our 2023 MI, spelled M-I, Response to Hate virtual campaign forums. We will have a new installment every month through September, at which time the campaign will culminate with our annual MI Response to Hate conference. The spirit of this campaign was captured by our team through development of the PSA, which is to follow. Please watch.
Did you know that race is the #1 motivating factor for hate crimes in the United States?
Did you know that hate crimes against Asian Americans have increased by over 73% since 2019?
Did you know that there are state and federal laws that protect you against hate crimes and bias incidents?
The Michigan Department of Civil Rights and the Michigan Alliance Against Hate Crimes have launched the My Response to Hate campaign to inform Michiganders of hate crimes and bias incidents occurring in Michigan.
You can take action in your own way by showing love, not hate.
If you see something, say something.
Support victims. Report the incident.
Make a commitment.
My response to hate.
My response to hate.
My response to hate.
My response to hate is love.
Visit michigan.gov/MDCR for more information on hate crimes, bias incidents, and available resources.
It is our hope that the campaign provides you with the information pertaining to hate and bias prevention that you can implement and use in your daily lives, at your places of work, in your schools, and in your communities. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into today's topic. Today, we will be talking about mitigating bias in Michigan housing. We have a dynamic panel of presenters lined up for you today, who will lead us in exploring what the law says about discrimination in the sale and purchase of homes, trending issues, and potential solutions for buyers, sellers, and real estate professionals. We are very excited to welcome our first presenter, who will discuss housing discrimination and the Black-white home ownership gap. Please join me in welcoming Austin Clemens, the Director of Economic Measurement Policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Prior to joining Equitable Growth, Austin was an assistant research scientist at the Public Policy Research Institute at Texas A&M University, where he researched criminal justice policy. Clemens holds a bachelor's in economics from the University of Texas and a doctorate in political science from the University of Georgia. His work has appeared in the ESPN Magazine, Smithsonian Magazine, Legislative Studies Quarterly, and the Journal of Business and Politics. Mr. Clemens, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Tiara. And my name is Austin Clemens. I'm going to try to provide some of the kind of broad context for this session today, talk a little bit about the homeownership gap, and give you all an idea of what some of the kind of history of the creation of that gap is. And I want to thank the Michigan Department of Civil Rights for having me today. It's such a pleasure to be here. All right, can I have the next slide, please? So just for context, I want to start with this kind of big picture look at the homeownership gap. So this graph is showing you from 1976 through 2016 what homeownership rates look like for white, Hispanic, and Black households. And as you can see, there's a huge gap between white and Black home ownership. That gap in recent years is about 25 percentage points. So it's a difference between sort of the low 40% for Black households and sort of the high 60s for white households. All right, next slide, please. So why do we care about housing so much, first of all, beyond just the fact that people like to own their own homes? I want to just kind of motivate the question a little here. So in the USA specifically, housing wealth has kind of a lot of unique properties compared to other kinds of wealth that people collect. So first, there's favorable tax treatment. You might be familiar with the mortgage rate interest deduction, which can give people a pretty hefty break on their taxes, especially if they own very valuable homes. It's really kind of a tax break that gets more valuable the richer you are, unfortunately. Second, you get to build equity while you pay your rent, right? So when you're paying your rent on a mortgage, some portion of that is, of course, taxes, some portion of that is interest, but some portion of that is paying down your principal. It's essentially like you're saving as you pay your rent. Third, once you have built some equity through that process, right, then your home becomes essentially a financial instrument that you can leverage in a variety of ways. You can use it as collateral for loans. You can take equity out of your house. And so it becomes a tool that you can use to build wealth in other ways. Of course, eventually your payments are finished. This is one of the biggest advantages of owning a house, right? Is that if you buy a house when you're, say, 30 or so, right, you probably get a 30-year mortgage. And so you might be finished paying for your house by the time you retire. And that's a huge source of security for people as they move into retirement, as they move into old age. Historically, housing has increased in value at a pretty good pace. It's not the best investment in the economy, but it's a good investment. And especially given all these other advantages, right? It's a very good investment for people. And so not only are you building equity, but also the value of your house is just increasing, which is, again, giving you more financial options. And then this last bullet, just to make the point that because of all these features, there's a huge sort of intergenerational component to homes where if your parents successfully, bought and owned a home and have paid for most of it or all of it, right? That gives them a lot of space to help you, to help their children as they start to want to go to college or buy homes or other kinds of financial life events like that. So there's a lot of reasons that owning a home specifically is a very valuable form of wealth in America, very important form of wealth in America. Next slide, please. And this is especially true for the middle class. So this graph here is just showing sort of from left to right, different kinds of households, how much of their total wealth is home equity, is essentially wealth that is in their house. So for a lot of middle class people, you might also have 401k wealth. That's another significant portion. But can I have the next slide, please? If we just highlight these left two bars, and I'll explain what these are. If you lined everyone up in the entire country according to how much wealth they have, so from lowest wealth all the way down to the highest wealth, and then you just look at the middle 50%, so the half of people who are in the middle of that line, that's what these two bars are here. The one on the left is the 25th percentile through the 50th, so it's the people who are just under the middle, essentially, and the one on the right is people who are over the middle. For both of those groups, people you might think of as roughly middle class, right? Sort of kind of lower middle class to upper middle class. Housing wealth makes up half of all of the wealth they have, right? So it's the single most important form of wealth for this group of people. These bars off to the right are richer Americans. So, at the very far end here, we have the top 1% of Americans, the wealthiest 1% of all households. And what you see for them is that, they might be holding a lot of housing wealth. They probably are holding a lot of housing wealth, but it's just not as important to their whole portfolio because they're also holding stocks. They might own businesses, that kind of thing. And so as you get richer, the importance of home ownership diminishes a little. But for the middle class especially, owning a home is really the primary source of wealth for most of these families. All right, can I have the next slide, please? So it's a very important form of wealth for the middle class. And it has been historically very important for Black households. So between 1950 and 2020, on average, housing wealth has made up 59% of all wealth for Black households and 38% of all wealth for white households. So it's been a very important way for Black households to build and retain wealth in the economy. All right, next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to go through just a little bit of history to explain how we got to that first chart I showed you, that 25 percentage point homeownership gap between Black and white households. You may recognize this kind of map. This is a redlining map. So these are maps that were created in the 1930s by a federal agency, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And what these maps were supposed to do is they were supposed to guide banks in making lending decisions and deciding where to invest. And this is a map of Detroit. And I've included a link down here. This was actually a map created by a doctoral student at the University of Michigan. If you follow this link later when the slides are shared, he has a great presentation on the history of redlining in Detroit that I think people would find interesting. The map here is showing you, so red areas are areas that HOLC, that federal organization, said you should not lend in, basically. Told banks they were too risky to lend in. And these were majority Black areas. These were areas where Black people had families, owned some homes, did business. And then you can see there's sort of a range of other colors. Green was the best. And so you'll see out in East Detroit, we have these green neighborhoods that were primarily high income white neighborhoods. All right, next slide, please. So what did these redlining maps do? Well, along with a host of other sort of mechanisms that were created to prevent Black people from buying and owning homes, these redlining maps meant that Black households just could not get loans in any of these areas. They were considered too risky. And if they did get a loan, they were often given very poor terms on those loans. So they might be paying higher interest rates. So there was discrimination in the mortgage terms that were being handed out. And so during this era, it was very hard for Black people to own homes at all, even if they were pretty high income at the time. Now, there were some other historical challenges that happened kind of at the same time. So one that was particularly notable, and I should say some also, in addition to redlining, we had things called racial covenants, which were basically kind of terms attached to the deed of a property that said only white people can live here. We also had a lot of Black wealth destroyed in the sort of post-World War II era, especially from the building of the national highway system. And so actually, if you can jump back to the previous slide real quick, this red area that's kind of just to the right of downtown Detroit, where the word Detroit appears there, this is a neighborhood that, and I'll just say I don't know Detroit that well, so hopefully I'm correct on these, but I believe this area is called Black Bottom. And this was in the 1930s and 40s. It was an area where a lot of Black families lived. And once we get into the post-war period, the 40s and 50s, quite a lot of homes in this neighborhood were bulldozed to make way for the federal highway system. And so what happened was those homes were claimed by eminent domain. And often those homeowners were not fairly compensated for what they lost. All right, let's take us to the next slide, please. And I won't say too much about this. I think it'll come up in subsequent presentations, but also a discriminatory problem we still have today is appraisals are frequently discriminatory, and that can lower the value of homes that are owned by Black families. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so that was sort of the 40s and 50s. I want to also talk about the Great Recession, because the Great Recession had a massive impact on homeownership in the US. And so this is a graph that's showing you in blue rates of homeownership in 2007, before the Great Recession. And then in orange, rates of homeownership in 2019. So after all of the recovery from the recession, but right before the pandemic. And what you can see is that homeownership rates went down for essentially everybody in the economy. So we had homeownership rates close to 80% before the Great Recession. And after the Great Recession, closer to about 70%. You can see that drop in the first set of bars. And then in this next three set of bars, you can see how this broke down by race. And so white homeowners saw their rates of homeownership go down, but we saw a much more precipitous drop among Black homeowners. Hispanic homeowners saw a somewhat precipitous drop. And then these last three sets of bars are by income percentage. And so the top 10% is actually one of the few groups where homeownership went up a little. And so we're seeing that there's some consolidation where people who are already rich are becoming essentially even more likely to be homeowners. And then at the bottom of the distribution, you see this next 40%, and then the bottom 50%. That's the sort of poorest half of American households, the lowest income half. They saw the greatest declines in homeownership. Next slide, please. And what was the impact overall? So this is now a chart of net worth, not just homeownership. So this is all wealth held by white, Black, or Hispanic households. And what you can see, there's this area on the left of the graph that's a little lighter. That's the Great Recession. And what you can see is that everyone's wealth dipped going into the Great Recession, right? So lots of home wealth wiped out, lots of other effects as people lost their jobs and so on and so forth. And then wealth was kind of flat for a little while, and then it started ticking back up for everybody. But I think what's important is to look at 2019 and to see that at the end of this recovery from the Great Recession, Black homeowners were still, or Black households generally, sorry, were still about 15% poorer wealth-wise than they had been before the Great Recession, whereas white households managed to build a modest amount of wealth in this recovery of about 15 points. Next slide, please. And this stuff really matters, these sort of short-term fluctuations, because when a group falls behind in homeownership, it can be hard to recover. If you recall those early slides I was showing you, where I was talking about, the advantages of homeownership, that if your parents are able to own their house as they're moving into retirement, they have a lot more resources to support their children. And so it can be really hard once this sort of discrepancy develops to recover from that. And we can kind of see that in patterns, recent patterns in homeownership. Millennials, for example, who were born in the 80s, had homeownerships that were considerably lower than those born in the 70s, sort of Gen X, people who were born in the 70s. And that's because millennials faced kind of a poor job market for their early career, and also because the Great Recession really harmed their homeownership prospects. It's important, right? Later entry to homeownership means less financial stability, less ability to help the next generation. All right, next slide, please. I think I'm doing okay for time. This will be my last slide. So let's talk a little bit about what's happened in the pandemic. The pandemic has made the housing market very strange, is one way to think about it. The pandemic convinced lots of people to get their own space. And so, if you were living with a roommate, if you were living with your parents in your parents' basement or something, A lot of people said, I don't want to spend the whole pandemic cooped up with all these other people. I want my own house. And so lots of people either bought homes or moved into their own rental properties. And that drove up demand and really spiked the cost of housing. At the same time, we saw that we started to have inflation in the economy due to a host of factors, really the pandemic, right? Logistics problems that the pandemic created, the Ukraine war and some of the effects of that. And so that inflation, the standard response of the Federal Reserve to inflation is to raise interest rates. Raising interest rates makes mortgages more expensive. And so we have kind of a double whammy for people who want to buy homes right now. The value of homes has gone up a lot because of high demand during the pandemic, and mortgage rates have gone up a lot because the Federal Reserve is trying to fight inflation. What that means is that it's really difficult for new buyers to get into the market right now. And we have a lot of anecdotal evidence that what is happening instead is that a lot of houses that are being sold to people who already have a lot of cash on hand, and so don't have to pay these higher mortgage rates and can afford more expensive homes. What kind of people are those? Well, they're going to tend to be older, they're going to tend to be white, they're going to tend to be quite high income. And so we see those people really moving into the market, a difficult market where maybe young, less affluent home buyers are really struggling. Now, I've shown you a lot of numbers that end in 2019. That's because one of the best sources for data on homeownership is the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, which is releasing this September. It's only run every 3 years. So we're going to know a lot more about what happened during the pandemic in 2022. And I think, if you're interested in this area of policy, it'll be super important to check and kind of see what people are finding out late this year when we start to get those survey results. All right, that's it for me. Thank you so much, Tiara, and I will turn it over to the next presenter.
Thank you so much, Mr. Clemens. I really appreciate your presentation and for giving us a sobering look into housing discrimination and the racial divide that we are currently seeing in home buying across the United States. I'm sure that our attendees will have questions for you at the end of the program. As of right now, we are going to hear from a Michigan real estate expert who is going to walk us through some of the common issues that realtors are seeing firsthand and offer some practical solutions for mitigating bias. Please welcome Talisa Cohen, who is a realtor and CEO of the Next Level Real Estate Group, brokered by eXp Realty, LLC. Having achieved multi-million dollars in sales production, Talisa has been recognized as one of EXP's top performing realtors in the state of Michigan, while also mentoring an elite group of real estate professionals of varying experience who aim to effectively grow their business. Licensed in the state of Michigan, Talisa serves the Metro Detroit area, advocating on behalf of buyers and sellers in residential and commercial real estate. She has a BS in business administration and a highly reputable professional track record. Talisa also has 15 plus years in the corporate sector, serving as an IT professional, project manager, and trainer. It was during this time that she found her purpose in serving the community and helping decision makers take action. Talisa enjoys coaching people and leveraging data-driven insight as they navigate to their desired outcomes. As an avid negotiator, Talisa has built her real estate career focused on these pillars: advocacy, accuracy, and efficiency, continuous delivery and process improvement, stellar communication and follow-through, empowerment through education, and perhaps most important, solid relationship building. Talisa is proud of the reputation that she formed for making her clients feel empowered and knowledgeable through their real estate transactions. Ms. Talisa Cohen, we are so glad to have you with us here today, and we are eager to hear your presentation.
Thank you very much, Tiara, for that introduction. I'm like, geez, this Talisa sounds awesome. No, are you able to hear me?
This is Tiara speaking. Yes, your sound is good.
Oh, okay, great. So I would like to start the presentation, and a lot of the information that I have in my presentation mirrors what Austin was able to share with the group. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on these slides, the information in the slides verbatim, but I would like to speak more intently on my experience as a realtor and the way that I am seeing some of these biases affect clients that are looking to purchase homes, as well as those that I work with that are selling properties, especially or specifically my clients that are people of color. So if we could, the title of my presentation is The Hardships of Home Ownership. I am Talisa Cohen. I am a realtor and CEO of the Next Level Real Estate Group that is brokered by eXp Realty. And I am going to be talking to you mostly about my day-to-day experience and the day-to-day experiences of my colleagues that are working in the real estate industry. Can we advance to the next slide, please? So this is just an introduction. You'll notice here behind my name, there are some initials. These are designations and certifications that I have received throughout my real estate career as an accredited buyer's representative, a senior representative. I also have my green certification, which is focused on energy efficiency in real estate properties. And then the green is about renegotiation or negotiation. So those are just a few of the certifications or designations that I hold that are recognized by NAR, which is the National Association of Realtors, as well as the local association. Can we advance to the next slide, please? I wanted to say thank you to the Department of Civil Rights for creating this space for us to have this conversation, to talk about something that is very much an issue in our community and affects all of us as a whole. So I wanted to take the time to say thank you for the opportunity. Next slide, please. So just to recap, the American dream, part of the American dream is, once worded by Thomas Jefferson, we have the Declaration of Independence that says that we have the preservation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is the goal. And once that is revised and written, the Declaration talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of. A part of this American dream is the right to own property, the right to own our own home, and to feel like we belong in our community. And part of the way of doing that is to become a homeowner. We have had many different laws that have addressed racial discrimination and segregation of people, like the Emancipation Proclamation, the Fair Housing Act, and then, recently we've all experienced the civil unrest of 2022 following the murder of George Floyd. And with each of these events and the acts, we have legislation that has been instituted or implemented, but there is still the bias that we see in a day-to-day practice of real estate that is requiring further discussion, which makes it purposeful and important for us to have discussions like what we're having today. Next slide. So the American dream, home ownership as described by dictionary.com, is homeowner is a person homeowner means a person who owns a home, or a person who owns a home that he or she or they live in a specific. Next slide. Some of the benefits, I believe Austin Cherokee, some of the benefits of home ownership are financial stability, financial strength, because we're building value in our properties, communities as we own homes and continue to care for those homes and add value. There are some tax benefits to home ownership as well. Having a place where we belong not only helps financially, but with the self-efficacy, us feeling like we belong to a particular community and have some accountability and purpose in life. That is a benefit that is financial as well as emotional and interest. And then that sense of community, being a homeowner and feeling like you own a piece of a community, I think we can all agree makes us feel one with that particular area, our neighbors, and the things that are taking place in the community. So we work hard to advocate and add value to those areas. Next slide, please. I think we. So I won't go back to the other slide. This slide here again mirrors one that was shared by our previous presenter talking about household wealth. This just shows the different races and ethnicities and how wealth has grown or changed over time. This study is showing data from 1989 through 2022. Next slide. So I thought this slide was interesting to include because it talks about the U.S. division of wealth and shows how wealth is established in the United States. And you will see, like, amongst the top 1%, top 20%, there is a pretty fair mix of different types of assets and liabilities that would impact one's wealth or net worth. And when we go down and look at the middle class, it is, I will not say disproportionately, but a major portion of what establishes wealth amongst the middle class, and then the second 20% and bottom 20% is heavily weighted on real estate. So I think that's important to point out as we continue on with this. Next slide, please. And just as a point of reference, this particular slide is based on data that is provided by the Federal Reserve. Some of the home ownership disparities, according to CNN, now all buyers have the same shot at home ownership, and it is wealth generating process in the United States. The reasons include historical prejudice and redlining practices that continue today. So even though, like I pointed out earlier in the presentation, we have had laws that have addressed racial discrimination and have created legislation that is supposed to protect all of us from these types of treatment, there's still the presence of tactics such as redlining, mortgage lending discrimination, high cost of ownership, and income disparities for Blacks and Hispanics compared to whites and Asians that still make achieving that American dream that much harder for Blacks and Hispanics, which in turn impact or restrict the ability to build generational wealth. Next slide. So increasing attainability, homeownership programs. There are a number of programs. As a real estate professional operating in the market today, I will say that there are a number of programs that have been launched that seem to be aimed towards making home ownership more of an opportunity or possibility for those who are eligible. Now, we will get more into the eligibility further on into the presentation. Some of these programs that are being launched, that have been launched, do offer down payment assistance. I apologize for the acronym, but so that you know what DPA stands for, that is down payments. And then there are also more relaxed credit requirements for some of the loans that have been introduced into the market today. So we do acknowledge that some effort is being made to make home ownership more of a possibility, but there's still more work to be done. Next slide, please. Some of the critical factors for home ownership are income. Income and earning potential are critical factors in determining prospective homeowners, home buyers. And studies continue to show evidence of wage disparities for Blacks compared to their counterparts in the same role. So if I could talk about real world experiences here, and hopefully we get too far ahead of the presentation, we talk about some of these new home loan programs that are available today to potential home buyers. And I specifically work with a large portion of first-time home buyers. What I've seen in my experience is that debt to income is a huge factor as a person to purchase a home, or what type of home they're able to afford or qualify for in terms of finance. So when we are looking at someone's mortgage eligibility, yes, it's true that there are programs that are out there that provide down payment assistance, as well as they may have lower credit requirements. They don't necessarily bridge the gap completely for those who may be lower earners, especially as we grow into our real estate market in Michigan begins to shift and change, where values are exponentially higher. The cost to purchase a home is exponentially higher than what it was 10, 20 years ago. These same buyers who are in the market today find it very difficult to be able to afford a house because of their income or earning potential is less than what some of their counterparts in the white and Asian. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, can we go back one to the previous slide? I wanted to point out that we have an organization called the National Association of Real Estate Brokers. This is an organization that is established not just for Black agents that are operating in real estate, but that is the primary audience. And so the executive director, Antoine Thompson, says this kind of gap impacts neighborhoods, families, schools, quality. Skip ahead a bit. Oh, I think we're advancing forward, and we have to go back a couple. But the point is that when the incomes are disproportionately lower in Black and Hispanic communities, that impacts the value of the home, the way the residents in the area are able to maintain those properties. The lower property taxes will have an impact on local services as well as the school system. So what we need to see and want to see is that there is higher values placed on homes in these communities, so that the ripple effect would be that you have a correction and an adjustment and an increased quality of living as it relates to these other areas, as well as proportionately impact the ability to build that generational wealth that we continue to talk about. Next slide. Some of the obstacles for home ownership, the obstacles hindering Blacks and brown people in home ownership today. This has been my experience when I have my consultations with clients that are coming to work with me as first-time home buyers, and sometimes even as repeat homeowners. There's this high cost of education. So student loan debt is really high. And I have a slide here that shows some of the variances in student or education debt that will inherently impact one's ability to purchase a home and obtain more credit in the future. The wealth gap. So that is one of those obstacles that hinders, because competing in the market, in the market that we've experienced since the pandemic, where rates were at an all-time low for borrowing funds. We also saw that home values were increasing at record levels in many of the areas throughout Michigan. And throughout many of the areas throughout Michigan specifically, we saw that home values had increased astronomically and were reaching historical highs. And that wealth gap, we noticed a difference in when a lot of my buyers were attempting to purchase homes, they were being outbid by people who were able to bring cash offers, all cash offers. And for homes that were in high value areas as well as in some of the inner city neighborhoods. And it made it very competitive to compete with those offers to be able to accomplish home ownership when you are competing against other home buyers who may have that reserve or whose family may be able to contribute to their home buying process, allowing them to pay cash or do very large down payments. So that is definitely one of the obstacles that is faced still to provide Black background. Lack of financial literacy and training. So when I am working with buyers and sellers, we go through a consultation. We talk about the process from a beginning to an end at a high level. We talk about for buyers specifically, what are some of the requirements or things that a lender might ask them in order for them to be eligible to borrow money to purchase a home. And what we're finding, what I find specifically, is that there is a huge gap or need for education before we can even get into the process of getting them qualified or pre-qualified for a mortgage and then shopping for a house. And then that education process continues on throughout the process. But as I mentioned in my introduction, or I believe Sierra mentioned during the introduction, one of the pillars for my business, my company, is that we empower through education. So the hope is, even for our first-time home buyers or repeat home buyers who may not necessarily have been as astute about the process and what the requirements are to be mortgage eligible, that by the time that we conclude the transaction, they will have that information, be able to share with their family members, so that we have this continuous cycle of individuals who will understand that they are eligible to be homeowners, that they will understand what that process looks like so that they can work on preparedness and planning, as well as building this generational cycle of home ownership and generational wealth. One of the other or last obstacles that I have on here is low representation. So what I've noticed being a filter is that there are disproportionate numbers in terms of Black cases and Black and Hispanic cases as well. We could combine those two demographics together. And I'm sorry if you're having we can combine those two groups together, and the numbers still far outweigh the number of white agents that are licensed to practice in this area. And where I feel like that creates, or there should be a conversation around that, is because there are certain things that would hinder, and I've listed some of them here, that a person of color may be able to relate to and advocate on behalf of all clientele to make sure that the home buying opportunity is one that is fair and equitable for anyone who has worked hard to put themselves in a position to purchase a home and who aspires. Next slide, please. So I won't go into detail about this, but I did touch a bit on student loan debt. And this slide here talks about how the Education Data Initiative states that Blacks and African American college graduates owe an average of $25,000 more in student loan debt than white college. and lending guidelines have a threshold at about 40% that's income. So this can drastically impact one's ability or their buying power when they're going to apply for a mortgage to purchase a home. And I cited where the statistics about the difference between home student loan debt by race, and the source is cited as educationdata.org, and this was in an article that was released January 2023.
Lisa, this is Tiara speaking. I apologize for interrupting your presentation, but our interpreters are reporting having significant difficulty with your audio at this time. I'm not sure if there's an adjustment that we can make to make it easy.
Well, I apologize. I am at the airport, so I've moved around to a couple of different locations. Is this better? I can try to get closer to the microphone on my laptop. Does that help?
This is Tiara speaking. I received a signal from one of our interpreters confirming that the sound was better. Thank you.
Oh, okay, perfect. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I won't spend a lot of time on this slide either because it mirrors what Austin shared where we talk about the wealth gap. I do think that it's important to point out that this diagram on the right side of the slide talks about percentage of families with asset types. So this basically breaks down wealth by race and various asset classes that are used to calculate one's net worth. And you will see that primary residence is at the top of the list. So owning a home is very critical and important to one's ability to build wealth in this country. And you will see that whites compared to Blacks and Hispanics definitely are reported to own property at almost twice the rate of Blacks and Hispanics. And then there are other asset classes in terms of vehicles and retirement accounts that also show very similar trends in terms of whites needing or having a higher percentage of these types of investments compared to other racial groups. Can we go to the next slide, please? Next. This slide. So talking about some of the hindrances to home ownership. And it says major reasons blacks don't purchase real estate. One being a lack of financial literacy. There are a lot of myths around home ownership that need to be dispelled. And I think that will be done over time through programs like this and others that we can do in the community to dispel some of the myths and increase education, as in addition to launching home loan programs, which our federal government and some of the other local banking institutions have done to make eligibility requirements a bit more lax. But there's still that piece of the financial literacy. Fear of income loss is another reason why a lot of Blacks explain that they are not ready to purchase a home. And we talked about that disparity in income and the wage, equal pay for equal work. That is a topic of discussion that has been ongoing in our community for many years. And so here we talk about Blacks being afraid that they're going to lose income, so they don't want to commit to purchasing a home for fear that they won't be able to afford the home if they lose the job. Non-traditional earners, many of the Blacks, Hispanics, especially our millennial population, have definitely taken opportunities to be non-traditional earners and being entrepreneurs, freelance work, but our financial system is not yet on pace to be able to give them the credit for this income to help them qualify for a home loan program. So until, I see that there are advancements in that as well, and that's another part of that financial literacy piece where we are, myself and others that are working in the profession, mortgage lenders as well, are talking with business owners, small business owners, freelance contractors on what they need to do in terms of organizing the business so that the money that they earn through these non-traditional ways or functions can count and help them qualify for a mortgage. Lack of savings. So when you have this large wealth gap on a wage disparity, and the cost of living, we can all agree, has increased astronomically. It makes it very difficult for people to save, for you to build that household savings. And we see this even more so in Black and Hispanic homes. So when it's time to purchase a home, we talk about some of those advantages that whites and Asians might have, where they have that generational wealth that has already been established, where they are able to get assistance from family members or from their own savings to be able to make more appealing offers and to have their offers accepted and compared to the way that Blacks and Hispanics are able to compete in such an inflation-driven market. Next slide, please. Factors that impact mortgage home readiness. I think I've touched on this a bit, so I won't go into that one. If we go to the next slide. So, and I talked about representation. Low representation definitely has impacted our real estate market, not only here in Michigan, but I believe throughout the U.S. Real estate agents in Michigan, according to NARA.com and the Census Bureau, fewer than 6% of all real estate professionals are Black, compared to 74.6% who are white and 8.79% who are Hispanic. And so what this does, I know that we have fair housing laws that prohibit discrimination based on race, familial status, and other protected classes. But when you are able to identify with some of those obstacles or hindrances that might impact the person's ability to qualify or prepare to be able to purchase a home. It's like if you don't know about it, if you're not aware of it, you can't really address it. So that is where diversity and representation really is important. And we are seeing that legislation at the federal and state level are starting to address some of these things because people of color, specifically Black agents, who are working with customers out in the market, are bringing some of these issues to the forefront, like the high student loan debt, creating an obstacle for eligibility for homeowners, the low credit score, for the challenging credit. And one might say, well, we all have the same opportunity to amass good credit. There are some underlying issues that need to be addressed, like the financial literacy and education, that we can't ignore, that creates more of a challenge for some people to understand how credit is compiled and calculated so that they can take proper action, create better habits to achieve the levels of credit scores and the savings and things of that nature that they need to have in order to be eligible to compete in this financial marketplace. Successful. Next slide, please. So the impact of lack of diversity. I talk here about undervalued appraisals. And so according to the New York Times in 2022, the Biden administration implemented legislation that ordered over 42 million appraisal reports to be released. And I think this is very important because when we talk about real estate and the way that real estate helps to build wealth, generational wealth, and create opportunity, it's all based upon the value of the property. So if we, studies have shown, especially through these studies that have been able to be done since Biden administration required these appraisal reports to be released, a large number of them were determined to show evidence where homes in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods were devalued. And they took the appraisal reports and compared them with the census data to be able to come to these conclusions to where it was clearly identifiable that homes that were in areas where they were predominantly Black or Hispanic, the home values in those areas were disproportionately low. So prior to 2022, there was no access to these appraisal reports. I won't go too far into the process, but when you're purchasing a home, one of the steps just before you're able to get final approval from underwriter is that the property that you're purchasing has to be appraised. And you want that value to be equal or less than preferably, equal to or greater than what the purchase price of the home is, so the borrower is able to optimize on what they're able to borrow to purchase that property. And also in the case of a refinance, there are many different opportunities that take place when you own a property and you have that property evaluated. You want for the values to have increased ideally so that you are establishing equity. And equity is that difference between what you have invested into the home in terms of purchase price and other lines of credit maybe against the property compared to what that property is valued in the market at that particular time. So home appraisals are very critical and important to building one's net worth and that generational wealth. Because if properties are being properly valued, when you are taking the opportunity to exercise or leverage the equity that you have established in your house, either through lines of credit or sale of that property, those are monies that you are able to leverage in other types of investments, maybe into purchasing the next property, paying down debt, and a number of other ways that you are able to leverage that equity. But equity is only possible if there is a positive difference between the value of the property and the outstanding debt that's owed on that asset. So I know that I was asked to talk about some of the real world experiences that I've seen in the market as a realtor. And I will say that unfortunately, even with the Fair Housing Act being in place, I personally have experience with some of my clients who were purchasing in various neighborhoods, or they themselves being people of color and sellers, because these rules and these laws are in place that says that you can't discriminate based on law, but we see based on evidence that was provided in some of these reports that were released in 2022, that if the evidence is there that discrimination was taking place based on race. And I have seen it where some of my sellers who were Black were selling properties, and when the properties were appraised, they were lower. But when you go and have them remove all of their artifacts and pictures and things that would suggest race or who lives in the home, that those properties were valued much higher. And so this practice needs to be eradicated so that we can have this fair exchange of property and value and continue to build wealth. And I will say that the Biden administration is doing work in regards to this space. We have the Fair Appraisal Act that was introduced recently that further says that you cannot discriminate when you're appraising a value based on the protected classes. And they've also instituted an agency that is, they created an agency that is going to be in charge of evaluating those appraisals if a complaint is filed and escalated. So we hope to see some positive changes coming from that agency place and also from conversations and forums like this. Next slide, please. I believe this is my last slide. So some of the potential solutions that would help to address these issues that are still outstanding past the litigation that has been put in place, but that will actually address the human need that is still there, would be like family planning services for people of color, so that we can be more proactive instead of reactive in the planning for our future. Financial literacy workshops, vocational training. This is very important because not only do we want to be able to purchase a home, it's very important that we understand how to maintain those properties and how to add value, because that continues to elevate the community and add value overall. And also for our personal pay equality. If we address the issue of this wage disparity and can get more into a equal pay for equal work situation, believe that we will increase buying power for people of color as well. And then home ownership advocacy. I believe that is all wrapped into, that is an all-encompassing way describing the 4 previous bullet points. If we have these services added, these additional resources, that will be the advocacy that we need to advocate on behalf of homeowners to make sure that they are not only able to purchase property, they're able to maintain and build wealth. Thank you for, hopefully I didn't go over.
Thank you so much, Talisa. So you pointed out some things for serious consideration, and we are thankful that you were able to bring your perspective to this forum. I would just like to remind our viewing audience once again that all presenters will be available for questions at the end of the program. At this time, we are going to welcome our final presenter, who is going to discuss what the law says about discrimination in the purchase and sale of homes here in Michigan. Please welcome Attorney Valerie Barkley, who is a staff attorney with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. Barkley provides legal guidance to the department's housing team, who investigates allegations of housing discrimination across the state of Michigan. Prior to moving to the Michigan Department of Civil Rights Office of Legal Affairs, she herself served as a civil rights investigator for 5 years. Barkley first began her career as a public servant in 2006 and has been employed by the state of Michigan in various capacities, including working as a Children's Protective Services investigator, parole officer, and corrections officer. Barkley is very proud of her well-rounded background, which she believes gives her a unique perspective. Today, we are excited to have her here with us to share her expertise on housing discrimination. Attorney Barkley, the floor is now yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Tiara. Can you hear me okay? I just want to make sure the volume is good. Okay, I had to move my room because, you know, dogs were barking and going crazy. So anyhow, thank you for giving me this opportunity to be with you all and for everyone joining us at home or from wherever you're at. I am Valerie Barkley and one of the housing staff attorneys here with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. And so we are going to talk about some stuff that's not super exciting, but I'm going to try to make it as engaging as possible, and that is the fair housing laws. So next slide, please. All right, before we get started, I do have to put this disclaimer out there. The information provided in this presentation does not and is not intended to constitute legal advice. All information, content, and materials used in the presentation are for general information purposes only and are not a determination of a particular individual's legal rights. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is fair housing? Essentially, fair housing is a person's right or a family's right to obtain the housing of their choice, free from discrimination from whatever protected classes may apply to them or to their family. So what does that really mean? How does that affect our living? So where you live essentially affects how you live. So this is the schools your kids go to. This is the availability of services, of healthcare choices, of facilities, of grocery stores, fresh food. So it is very crucial and important. Next slide, please. So fair housing laws cover a variety of different housing, pretty much anything you can think of, from apartment living to the real estate agents that you engage with when you're trying to buy a home or when you're trying to sell a home, co-ops, condos, subsidized housing, shelters, sometimes can be inclusive of things like Airbnbs and short stays, all those types of things, and anything you can kind of imagine in between. So next slide, please. And we're going to go over who a protected person is. So fair housing laws protect an aggrieved person. So somebody who has essentially been injured or has suffered some kind of harm by a discriminatory act, or perhaps somebody that believes they're going to be injured by an act that's about to occur, such as maybe an eviction. A person under the laws can also include government entities, corporations, and fair housing organizations such as fair housing centers. Immigration status does not affect your fair housing rights, and only the classes specifically listed in federal, state, and housing laws have protection. Next slide, please. All right. So protected classes. Between the state of Michigan's civil rights laws, the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act and the Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act, and the Federal Fair Housing Act, they're pretty similar. So you're going to see that they're almost identical, but Michigan does have a few added protections. So under federal, as you see on the slide, religion, race, color, national origin, sex, disability, and familial status are all protected classes. Michigan includes all of those I just named, and we also have protections for age and marital status. Early next year, we're going to be adding sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, as ELCRA was just amended somewhat recently. As we talk about familial status, keep in mind that familial status means families, people with children under the age of 18. And then marital status, that can be encompassing of if you are single, if you are divorced, a variety of different things there. So next slide, please. I wanted to put this slide in here. These are some areas that are not protected, but our agency often gets questions on these things, or some of these items are kind of brought into some of our cases. So criminal history. HUD has a really good guidance on how criminal records can be used when it comes to housing providers, rentals, and so on. This is not a protected class. So any complaint that has some criminal history or background check involvement in it has to be tied or connected to a protected class. So where this is kind of seen is, say you're applying for a rental property and you're denied rental because of whatever your criminal history is, and you happen to be Black. Okay. And then you find out that this same housing provider does not criminally screen or background check persons that are white, so that could be a complaint that you want to bring to our attention or to HUD's attention, or something that you can take directly to court through private counsel of your choice. So the distinction there is race. Race is the issue. So the Black person that was applying for the housing had their criminal history run, whereas the white person did not. But if a housing provider is running a criminal background check on everybody, they may be okay. All right, so source of income. Source of income is essentially what type of income you are purchasing your home with or your rental property. This could be, It's not a statewide protection currently, but there is some movement trying to make this a statewide protection. In fact, there's a big movement nationwide to make it, a nationwide protection as well. But there are 8, I believe, right now, local municipalities within Michigan that have source of income protections in their local discrimination ordinances. And so what these, they vary a little bit, but primarily it's, like HUD vouchers, Section 8 vouchers, things of that nature that can't be used against you if that's the type of income you're bringing to the table for your rental or for the home that you're purchasing. Okay, and then the last one, marijuana. Okay, so we know marijuana is still illegal for federal purposes, but many states have now legalized some form of use of marijuana. But, when it comes to housing, both public and, private providers can, have certain rules in place if they don't want marijuana on their property. In the public housing sector, if they're federal funded properties, they can't have it. It's just one of the rules. So these areas that I just discussed are not protected. Next slide, please. All right, and again, we kind of went over, these are the 2 state laws that you'll see on your screen. Elliott-Larsen, which we commonly refer to as ELCRA, and then Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I do apologize. These are kind of the, voluminous, a little bit on the boring side kind of slides. I'm going to not read them to you word for word or anything, and just try to, buzz through them a little bit, just kind of giving you a brief overview of the law. Certainly, I could talk to you all day long about housing rights because there's so much and there's so many nuances. But under both of our state laws, it is unlawful for a person engaging in real estate transaction to take a variety of actions, based on protected classes. So as you'll see over the next couple of slides, something like Part A here, refusing to engage in a real estate transaction. So essentially just not, looking at a person or engaging with them, looking at their offers for a transaction or denying a rental, all these different things. As you see, throughout the slide, there's a variety of other actions that are there. We're going to move on to the next slide, please, because there's a few other things. So here, you look at the slide and it seems like it's a lot of information, but really, it's making, a property unavailable, essentially telling a person that, hey, like this property might not be what you're looking for, or maybe this neighborhood's not looking, this neighborhood is not what you're looking for, and it somehow relates back to a protected class. You see, some of this steering, you see redlining, you see block busting, all these sorts of things that happen, and they're all prohibited when they relate back to a protected class, and they almost always relate back to a protected class. And then an F here, you see, this one is interesting because it's making, printing, circulating, posting, a variety of different things. And really what that boils down to is the advertising. So it is unlawful to advertise when protected class is somehow involved, or when one of the protected classes that we've already spoken about limits a person's ability to obtain a housing opportunity, or somehow has a preference like, hey, we only want, single persons or couples, no children, or straight persons or white persons or Jewish persons. So that would be kind of your advertising clause there. Next slide, please. All right. And then again, these are just the kind of the remaining provisions within our state statutes. And, it has protections for, when you're in the process of home buying, home renting, home selling, all of these certain things. So go ahead and move to the next slide, please. Okay, this provision here has to do with the MLS system. When you're, listing a home for sale, or when you're, engaging with real estate agents and brokers. So this is the membership, in those types of organizations, and they have protections as well. Next slide, please. All right, Section 504 of our state laws has to do with financing. So when you are trying to, acquire a loan to buy a house, to maybe build a brand new house, or take a home equity line of credit to, who knows, improve your home or maintain it, or, make those big improvements such as like a roof or window, things that are pretty costly, you might have to, engage with a lender to take out a loan to do some of those things. So that's where these protections are built into our statute, where, you know, a person's protected class cannot be used to, you know, make those decisions or to, you know, deny those things just because of any of these protected reasons. So next slide. Okay, and then I already kind of touched on this a little bit, but yeah, blockbusting. This is essentially where we're at, you know, where you are looking at, you know, potentially living in a neighborhood or, you know, selling in a neighborhood, I'm sorry. And, you know, you're kind of told like, hey, you know, there's more persons of color or more minority persons or people of this religion that are kind of moving in or infiltrating your neighborhood, and you better hurry up and sell because this, you know, all of these things that are happening in your neighborhood are going to decrease your property value. Like there's going to be more crime, your schools aren't going to be as good, and whatever else. So that's what this provision is covering, is that blockbusting. That's all based back again on protected classes. So, next slide. All right, and the slides that we just had, the last like 5 or 6 of them, dealt with both of our state statutes, but I wanted to put this slide here because the Michigan Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act, in the statute itself, there is an affirmative duty on housing providers to accommodate a person with a disability unless the housing provider can demonstrate an undue hardship. So if you're a person with a disability and you have disability related needs for accommodations or modifications, please make sure you are requesting those accommodations, because there are duties on providers to assess those needs and engage in the interactive process to, you know, evaluate the needs and how they can accommodate you. So next slide. All right, and then the next couple slides have to do with Person with Disabilities Civil Rights Act and some of the specific prohibitions in that act. You know, this section here is again back with the, you know, real estate transactions, which can also encompass your rentals and whatnot. This would be kind of, you know, telling a person who's maybe in a wheelchair that you can't look at a second floor unit because, you know, it's on the second floor. Wouldn't you want to be on the ground level? You know, it's those types of things, telling people, you know, that making properties unavailable because you think they might be better off in a unit, say closer to the clubhouse or closer to, you know, wherever the dumpsters are. A person with a disability should be able to access any unit that they see fit, that they know they're, you know, what they need and what they want. And so, you know, any person who is a real estate agent, a broker, or a leasing agent, you shouldn't be determining for that person what their needs are. Let them tell you what their needs are. Next slide, please. And again, this kind of just goes along in the same, you know, with person with disabilities. This has to do with design and construction. There's an entire guidance and a whole design and construction manual. It's very lengthy. There's a lot to it. Nobody knows it, you know, from start to finish. We look it up every time we have a question because it is so specific. But essentially, multifamily dwellings that have first occupancy after this special date of March 13th, 91. So that's our trigger date here. You know, they have to be accessible, have an accessible route, you know, accessible units and so on. So that's what this provision is covering in the law. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're moving on to Federal Fair Housing Act. As we have, you know, already gone over these protected classes, you can see on your slide where the initial Fair Housing Act was in 68 and it only covered race, national origin, religion. Then 74, sex was added. Then in 88, familial status and disability. Next slide. Okay, so similar to our state laws that we've kind of buzzed through pretty quickly, you know, in the interest of time here, you know, the Fair Housing Act, it does the same thing, prohibits discrimination in sales and rentals, terms and conditions, their steering, their redlining, financing, loans, you know, blockbusting, all of those different things for those protected classes. And just to remind you again, age and marital status are under state law. So that's why they're not present here in this slide. We're going to talk briefly in another few slides about retaliation, but there are built-in protections for retaliation. You know, complaints can be filed with HUD within 365 days of the date of an alleged discriminatory act. And you can also take your claims directly to court, which we'll talk a little bit about that too. Next slide, please. Okay, I kind of just really give you a brief overview because I do not want to bog you down today with all of the nuances of housing laws. But there are a few other laws that you'll see on your screen. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, Title VI, Housing for Older Person. There's ECOA. There's a few other, there's a bunch of other laws that apply to housing, not just the ones that we've gone through a little bit today. And they each, categorically have their own protections. So like housing for older persons has to do with senior housing. And there's, some nuances there that we're not going to get into for purposes of today, but just know that there are other laws that may be applicable to you or someone you know or care about. Next slide, please. Okay, we kind of touched briefly on sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression being a fairly recent amendment to our state law, ALPRA. And so on the federal side of things, those things have not been added. Those protections have not been added to the actual statute, or won't be as soon as ours will. But this is where the HUD equal access rule comes in, because sexual orientation, gender identity, those things are protected under this particular rule when it comes to HUD programs and housing, and federally backed and insured loans, stuff like that. So a person can't be just denied these things because of their orientation, their gender identity, and also marital status under this equal access rule. So it's just kind of an FYI, just because that there are state protections for these things, HUD, has this equal access rule that allows for some of those protections under the federal law as well. So next slide, please. Okay, I did promise that we talk a little bit about retaliation. So both the state and federal laws prohibit retaliation against a person for engaging in protected activity, under our applicable laws. So protected activity, what does that mean? And so a lot of people, we hear retaliation in this department thrown around quite a bit. And so I'm going to try to give you a brief overview of what that is. So for our purposes, civil rights law purposes, participation in a fair housing action, so filing a complaint or acting as a witness for your neighbor's complaint, something like that. You're participating in something that has to do or relate back to a protected class that would, and since we're talking about just housing today, I'm going to keep it specific to that, but a fair housing type of issue. Or instead of participation, it's your opposition to something that's occurring in a fair housing type of violation by an individual, by an organization, by, say, a real estate agent or a broker, or maybe a leasing agent, something like that. So if you have engaged in either, some participation in an action or opposing an action, and then something adverse happens to you, say an eviction, you now receive a notice to quit, you're going to be evicted because you spoke up against and opposed some type of, discriminatory policy of some sort, or you were a witness in your next door neighbor's MDCR complaint that they filed against your housing provider, and now you're subject to eviction. That appears potentially retaliatory. So you have protections that are built in to both state and federal laws that allow you to file a complaint, and pursue that. So that's where I'm at with this slide. Go ahead and please advance to the next. Thank you. Okay. Like with every rule, there are always exceptions to the rule. So I'm going to try to get through these pretty quickly. So for owner-occupied dwellings, there's some exemptions under Michigan law. So picture you own a duplex, you live in one side and you rent out the other side. You are exempt from fair housing laws when you live in an owner-occupied unit. Under the fair housing law, if there are 4 units, so say you own like a little small apartment building and there's 4 units or less, you live in one of those units, that's an owner-occupied exemption. Next slide, please. There are some exemptions for single family housing. So in Michigan, let's say you have a legal home, legal residence, you've lived there for a period of time, and then suddenly your job takes you out of state for, 9 months, 10 months, a year, whatever it is. So you decide to rent your home out for 12 months or less. But you lived in your home the 3 months immediately preceding that rental, and it's still your legal residence, you are exempt from fair housing laws. So that's where that first one comes. The Fair Housing Act, homes sold or rented by a private individual in which they don't use an agent or a broker, anything like that, they can be exempt if they don't own more than 3 single family homes at a time. So essentially, if you own a home and you want to rent that home out, and you don't advertise anywhere, you don't use a broker, and you happen to stumble across somebody that's looking to rent your home, and it's just kind of this agreement between the two of you, then you are generally exempt. Next slide, please. Okay, there are also a few limited exemptions. We're not going to get really into those too much, but religious organizations can give preference to their members, but they can't discriminate, based on other protected classes. Private clubs, very similar to that. And then again, that housing for senior persons comes up here as well. So next slide, please. All right, we did speak a little bit about advertising. Both federal and state laws, have some carve out there for advertising. Regardless of any exemption, any housing provider, has to make sure they're not advertising in a discriminatory manner. So we just talked about some single family home exemption. So in the one example I gave of a person, that's just wanting to kind of rent out their home, and they just stumble across somebody that's looking to rent, if they hadn't found that person and they started posting, let's say on Craigslist, and they had some discriminatory language, like I'm looking for a single white male or a couple to rent my home, no children, that kind of stuff is going to be discriminatory because it's limiting based on protected classes. And so although that person, that homeowner, would have had exemptions under that single family dwelling exemption, now that they've advertised out in public spaces, that exemption no longer applies. So they can be held, liable for any type of discriminatory behavior when it comes to that advertising. So, and then when it also comes to advertising, it's not just something that's just on a very public space, like a Craigslist posting or like an MLS posting, or maybe even, a real estate website or a rental website. It could be verbal statements. So where we see this come up a lot in advertising violations or even just advertising allegations is when people just call or go into, rental housing and stuff like that, and they're inquiring about properties or wanting to see properties, and they're, steered to a different property that they're not interested in, or they're told perhaps they have too many people in their family to qualify, for housing. So you get into kind of that occupancy standard, familial status issue. So yeah, verbal statements made by you or your agent could, get you on the hook here. So make sure you're careful. All right, next slide, please. On your screen, you're going to see some advertising examples that have come through our desks in our department. You'll see some that talk about marital status, some about age, some about familial status. There's many, many more examples. This was just kind of a little handful for you, so you can see what I mean when I talk about discriminatory advertising. Next slide, please. And then we have the use of human models. So don't throw anything at your screen. As you can tell, there are 3 photos on your screen right now. Each of the photos is pretty representative of some exclusive groups of people. That's what's wrong with this. This is why it's a really good example for you to see. If you were pulling up a website or you were scrolling Zillow or whatever, and you came across this advertisement, the first thing you would probably think of is, oh, this housing is only for like older white ladies, right? And that's why it's not good. That's why when we're using human models or drawings, things of that nature, we need to be more inclusive, more diverse. We can't essentially just make our advertisement look as though it excludes certain protected classes and is only encompassing certain ones. So what's problematic here again is all these photos pretty much just look like older white women. And okay, so maybe it's a senior housing, that advertisement that you've stumbled across, but what's missing here is any other races, national origins, ethnicities, things of that nature. All you see is white people. So keep that in mind for anybody that's joining us today that, designs websites or, that is in the housing provider market. When you're advertising, you can be really on the hook here for these kinds of things. So next slide, please. All right, so some more of this fun legal stuff. Statute of limitations. So under federal law, you have 1 year to file a complaint with HUD 1 year from the alleged date of harm when something has occurred to you based on your protected class. So 1 year, 365 days. You can also skip HUD if you want and go directly to court with your attorney of choice. And that statute of limitations is 2 years. Now, Michigan Department of Civil Rights, our state laws, we take complaints 180 days. So a little bit of a shortened time frame than HUD. However, if you give us a call and you are, beyond that 180-day time frame, we can certainly help you with your complaint, and direct you to HUD if necessary, if you're still within that 365 days. So the message here is don't delay. If something has happened to you that you feel is discriminatory, please give us a call, give HUD a call. And then the state court statute of limitations is 3 years from the alleged date of harm. So, all right, next slide, please. Okay, well, since I represent the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, I just wanted to go over how to file a complaint. We have a lot of different options. We are super available for you. You will see all of our different phone numbers, email. We have an online complaint form that you can fill out. Please feel free to visit our website, michigan.gov. /MDCR. We have our virtual intake, and maybe in the future we will be back open again to take in-person intakes, but we are very available for you. Certainly, check out our website. It's got a lot of really great information. And next slide, please. Okay, some hot topics. We did cover a little bit of this, criminal records, clean slate, kind of fair chance at housing. There is a lot of movement in our state and nationwide to try to figure out how to make housing more available for persons that have criminal records. So definitely keep an eye on that, because I'm sure it is going to change at some point in time. Source of income, we covered that. Assistance animals, always a hot button issue. Assistance animals covers both service animals and emotional support animals. You will hear terms, interchange all the time, but assistance animals, kind of that broad topic. There's always a ton of movement trying to figure out, how to expand protections, also how to limit protections, how to, figure out protections for your housing providers when they're met with these reasonable accommodation requests in housing, especially when it comes to service animals and emotional support animals, what kind of questions they can ask, what kind of documentation they can request, stuff like that. So certainly it's very hot topic. There's legislation all over the place, and guidances, stuff like that. That's always changing. So if this applies to you, certainly, keep an eye out there, because it's ever evolving. Tax assessments. This is another one where a lot of kind of grassroots organizations and fair housing organizations are kind of looking at these, more urban areas, more historically marginalized communities, and what their tax assessments are looking like, that their homes are definitely undervalued, but they're overassessed. And so they're paying way higher taxes than they probably should be. So that's definitely a hot topic. And then a huge one, we've heard a little bit about it today from our other presenters, appraisal bias, discriminatory appraisals. I know I was asked to kind of expound on this one just a little bit, so I'm going to try to fly through that, because I know in the interest of time, we got to get moving. But so we did hear a little bit about appraisals earlier, and that they are very critical to the home buying process. Essentially, the job of the appraiser is to establish the value of the home that you are either trying to sell, that you're trying to buy. For purposes of right now, I'm going to talk about just like the home buying process. So really, the appraiser's job is to value the property so it can be collateral for the loan that you're going to be taking out to purchase this home. So essentially, the appraisal is done by estimating the market value of the property, so that a lender can evaluate the risk in, furnishing that loan for you. And this value is typically determined by comparing the value of recent sales in your comparable neighborhood. And so, if that sounds kind of sketchy to you, it probably should, because if we're talking about undervaluing and, appraisal bias, discrimination in appraisals and so on, what that's doing is keeping, the neighborhoods that are historically marginalized at that lower value. If you're taking, a home and valuing it at something, and then another home in the neighborhood sells a few weeks later, they're going to use that lower value as a comparable. And so that's going to have kind of this trickle down effect on an entire neighborhood. And so all of these different families. So you've heard today from the other presenters and how, you can build wealth through, home buying and home purchasing and that sort of thing, and how it can create intergenerational wealth and so on. And so why discriminatory appraisals and appraisal bias is such a hot topic is because there has been so much research and data collected over a very, very long period of time. But I think as recent as 2021, some of the data is telling us that, when it comes to home buyers, like the home ownership gap is wider than it has ever been. And, I think in 2021 data, it was 44% of homes were Black, Black families, Black individuals, compared to their white counterparts, 74%. That's a 30% difference. Like, that is huge when we're talking about neighborhoods undervaluing homes and keeping that wealth gap growing wider and wider, and the money not being with our persons of color. And so there is a lot going on. I mean, right now there is a huge interagency task force going through the federal government. I believe the acronym for that is PAVE, P-A-V-E. I think it's Interagency Task Force on Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity. That was, that's they're collecting a bunch of data and coming up with strategies on how to combat this very, very issue. So lots to come on that. If you are in the process of buying a house, certainly, you know what your neighborhood is going to bring, work with a really good agent. And if you feel that you have been subjected to a discriminatory appraisal, there are built-in protections in both the state and federal law for this particular area. So that is it for my presentation. Turning it back over to you, Tiara. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Attorney Barkley. I'm sure that those listening have learned a lot about their protections and obligations under the law. With that said, we're actually going to switch over to our question and answer portion of the program. A lot of great information was shared today, and I want to make sure that our participants get all of their questions addressed. So at this time, I'm going to ask all of our panelists to turn on your cameras, and we will begin taking questions. As a quick reminder, please remember to state your name before proceeding to speak, and we will now open the floor for questions. As a reminder to participants, you are able to drop questions for the panelists using the Q&A function on the screen. And so as we wait questions from participants, I will pose a question to Mr. Clemens. You talked about the racial divide in home ownership. Can you tell us, if these trends continue and the gap continues to widen, what is the potential larger impact that this can have within our society?
This is Austin. Thanks for that question, Tiara. I think, I talked about those intergenerational effects, right? That if homeowners get to a stable place, they can help out their kids. I think, it's really hard for Black families to build wealth when they're shut out of the housing market, or when there are barriers for them to get into the housing market. There's some kind of broader research done by an economist, Laura Dernancourt, who looks at, how has the Black-white wealth gap changed over the past, I think she goes back like 150 years. And what she finds is that you see that gap rapidly close, like right after or during and after Reconstruction. But by the time we get to about the 1970s, it just levels off and it hasn't changed much. And so, I don't know if it's really so much the question that, things are going to get worse, but they've been stagnant for a long time. We haven't seen the homeownership gap close much. We haven't seen the wealth gap close much. And so, there just aren't ladders up for Black families. And I think, unfortunately, right now, we're not seeing any sign that that's going to reverse soon.
Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Clemens. So from a policy standpoint, what are some changes that you think would be helpful in mitigating bias in the sale and purchase of homes?
So this is Austin again. So I think there are a lot of ways to try to address this. One is just to think about kind of, why do we treat homeownership the way we do? I mean, we have like the mortgage interest rate tax deduction, for example, which is largely an upper class deduction, I would say. It helps people who buy pretty expensive homes the most. And so, we have some laws on the book that really privilege high income home buyers, and possibly we should revisit some of those. I think also we should just think about wealth in general. Apart from home ownership, I think there are good arguments for expanding the estate tax, which currently is only hitting wealth over $13 million. That's a really high number. And we could close some of the black-white wealth gap by having an expanded estate tax, by having wealth taxes or unrealized capital gains taxes. And so there's a lot of ways that we could both close that gap and raise some money that we could then spend on things like supports for new home buyers or baby bonds or support for renters. I don't think we should leave renters out of this, because when we don't actually give renters a lot of support in our economy, and renters who are successful, are the people who eventually become home buyers, and if they can save money while they're renting. So there are a lot of ways to tackle this, and a lot of different ways we could kind of get into closing the wealth gap a little. Thanks.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you for your answer, Mr. Clemens. And I see Ms. Cohen has unmuted. I believe she would like to add to that.
Yes, I would. Thank you, Tiara. This is Teresa Cohen speaking. And I wanted to add to Austin's answer. I believe that awareness and education are fundamental. We have to introduce into, especially the marginalized communities, various workshops and training courses that introduce these concepts, because I believe that because there has been this historical overwhelming population of whites and who have owned property and understood that that was an opportunity for them. That is different in like the Black and brown communities, where maybe there have been historically more renters than homeowners. And so now to be able to add that education and increase the awareness that home ownership is something that is not just for the rich and wealthy or a particular race, but it is something that all of us are able to attain and achieve if we are following the processes. And I believe that making the process a lot more relatable for everyone will also allow us to see a closing of that gap as well.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you for sharing that, Ms. Cohen. And actually, while you have the floor, Talisa, both you and Austin mentioned the impact of cash-only requirements in home sales. But what about sellers who are only willing to accept conventional loans versus FHA loans? Does this practice have discriminatory implications as well?
If I may respond, this is Talisa. I believe that there are some underlying discriminatory implications that, a seller is able to elect what financing types they will accept for the purchase of their property. And, there are various understandings of the differences between a conventional loan, for example, or an FHA loan. And undeniably, we all want to get to the money sooner with the least amount of risk or obstacles to get to the closing table. That's understandable. But in the case where everything is negotiable when you're talking about real estate. So I think that to deny someone the opportunity to make an offer or a fair offer on a property based upon their loan type, it is in fact discriminatory, because some of the things that I talked about in my presentation, like with regard to the debt to income ratio and exceedingly high education cost that is seen in some communities, Black specifically, trending to have more education or student loan debt than other races. I mean, that already could put that particular population at a disadvantage when you're talking about purchasing a home, because in those cases, maybe they are only able to qualify for an FHA mortgage because of the higher student loan debt versus conventional. So that in turn right there, if you're only going to consider conventional loans or cash, it just already excludes a whole population of home, borrowers.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you for that response, Ms. Cohen. Attorney Barkley, would you like to weigh in on this question?
This is Val speaking, and I will absolutely. So, I mean, I will put it out here in the interest of full disclosure is I'm in the process of getting ready to sell my house and then to purchase a different house. And somebody that has sold a house, somewhat recently last fall, one thing I didn't want to deal with, in my, secondary home was dealing with FHA loans or anything like that, because of the hoops that you have to jump through, the paperwork, all that kind of stuff that comes along with the home I sold in the fall was an older home. And, to make sure that it is up to like a particular code, not that I would ever sell like a lemon to somebody, but you know what I'm saying? There are certain things that FHA loans, require, that you have to, there's just a lot. Like you can't even have a paint chip on the wall. Okay. And so I can understand why, some buyers and sellers, some buyers want the FHA loan because it's low interest. Sometimes you don't even have to bring any money down to, the table and so forth. And so that's really great for first-time home buyers, or maybe the persons that were really affected adversely, by that 2008, market crash that ended up, losing their home and now in rentals. And now they're finally back to the space where they can buy again. But, from the seller standpoint, it can be a lot. It can be a lot of renegotiation. It can be a lot of repairs, that sort of thing. So, I mean, there's pros and cons every which way you look at it. And since, like I said, I'm in the market currently to sell my home and then to kind of downsize now that the kids are all grown up, and get a smaller property. And so what I'm finding to be challenging is every home that I try to look at, it is on the market for like 3.5 seconds. And before I even get a chance to go look at it, a cash offer has already come in. And I'm like, who's got this much cash in their pocket? So I just don't know what happened in the last 3 years where somebody just started giving out mountains of cash. I would love some for those that are giving it out, so that I could, be out here and competitive in this market, because it is probably the most competitive housing market. I've been in the purchase and, buying and selling of houses since I was about 26. So for almost 15 years now. And so like, this is the only time that I have ever, lost out on so many bids for houses. And it is really challenging. And I'm trying to do the conventional style alone at this point, trying to avoid the getting turned down at every corner with an FHA type loan. So yeah, it's very stressful out there for experienced buyers and for, I can only imagine, first-time home buyers. So
Thank you so much. This is Tiara speaking. Austin, I would like to give you an opportunity to address that same question as well from the standpoint of impact on particular populations.
Yeah, I have to be honest, I don't know exactly what the kind of rates are in the data on FHA loans, but it makes a huge difference. And I'll just echo what a lot of what Valerie and Talisa were saying. I actually bought my first, or attempted to buy my first home using an FHA loan, and it was extremely difficult. We lost a house because it didn't meet some requirement. It had a broken window or something. And then the house that my wife and I actually did end up buying was not making FHA loans available. And so even though it was a great option for us, we were kind of early in our financial journey, I guess, we weren't able to access it. And so it's a real problem for, it's a great opportunity for some first-time home buyers, but unfortunately, often does not pan out the way it should.
Thank you so much. We have one final question that a participant posed, and I will read that. The question is, can people choose the buyer if the home is not put on the market? And I see that Ms. Cohen did have to drop off as her flight was about to board, but I'm not sure if either of you are able to answer that question. I know she was the only realtor on the call. I'm not sure if either of you would have the answer to that.
So this is Valerie. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, it is in the purchase of a home, can the seller choose who they want? Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Now, I guess I'll just take a quick stab at it. Or the way I kind of interpret that question is if you have maybe multiple offers, the seller has the opportunity to then review those offers with, their agent and determine what's going to work best for them. So an example would be if you have, say your house is on the market for $100,000, we'll use a nice even number, and you have 3 offers come into you, one that is $90,000 cash. You have one that is $100,000 using an FHA loan, and then you have $95,000 using a conventional loan. So I think it's going to be a matter of determining which works best for your situation. As long as you're not throwing into the mix, I don't want a Black or brown person living in my neighborhood, or I don't want a Muslim neighbor, or I don't want a lesbian couple, to buy my home or whatever. As long as you're not throwing that in the mix, I mean, I've never been a real estate agent, but I think you have the opportunity, at least in my experiences of buying and selling, to determine which of those offers, best suits your needs. So if you're trying to hurry up and get out of your house, a cash offer lower than, the asking price may be the way to go for you. If you have a little bit of time and you don't mind going through the 3-ring circus of the, FHAs and appraisals and inspections and all that kind of stuff, then maybe you'll go with that $100,000 offer with that FHA loan. I think it just kind of determines on your situation. But as long as there's nothing that, is discriminatory about it or retaliatory, then I would say, yeah, you do have that option to kind of weigh those out.
Thank you so much. This is Tiara speaking, and we are officially out of time. So as we close, I would like to extend major thanks to all of our panelists. Your expertise and insights have been invaluable. I also would like to thank all of our registered participants and those who have viewed via live stream. We would like to welcome all of you back for our next campaign forum, which is scheduled for Thursday, May 25th, 2023 from 1 to 3 p.m. This next forum will focus on enhancing police legitimacy through procedural justice. You can learn more about the My Response to Hate campaign by visiting the Michigan Department of Civil Rights website at www.michigan.gov/MDCR, where you can also explore ways to get involved. Please be sure to check out the pledge that is available for download and distribution. And remember, eliminating hate and bias in our state is all of our responsibility. Thank you all so much for joining us today.